My name is Viorela. I'm with the LMU Munich. I would like to present to you today a study co-authored with Florian Arendt from the University of Vienna, and that was recently published in the International Journal of Press and Politics. It bears the title, Visual Cues to the Hidden Agenda, investigating the effects of ideology-related visual subtract cues in political communication. Okay, let me start with an example. We name a couple, and maybe we can see them here. We name a couple of them in the paper. I would like to talk to you about the one on the corner, on the left corner of the slide. There was this local politician in Austria who belonged to the conservative Austrian party, ÖVP. Wallner, this politician, just like his fellow party members, opposed the legalization of marijuana. So what happened here was that his team had photoshopped an image showing him talking to Sebastian Kurz on the left side of those images you can see there, after having posted them on Facebook. And in the revised version, the framed image on the wall behind them showed mountains instead of the original, which was an older woman smoking a joint. So why was this the case? Why was this done? Wallner's team had explained that the image was adjusted due to the politician's clear standpoint on the issue of cannabis legalization for recreational use. So what happened here was that political strategists had intentionally turned an image that was incompatible with the conservative ideology of the politician into one that was more consistent with it. So as a starting point for the study was the observation that politicians have a preference for cloaked language, which means that politicians are accused of not saying directly what's on their mind or how they feel about issues. And this cloaked language includes cues, which are tiny bits of information embedded in communication. So, for instance, in a political speech. So why would they use cues, you might wonder? Well, they have one main advantage, is that they hint at views in a subtle manner, while maintaining sufficient latitude to just backpedal in case of a public outcry. So if somebody complains, you can always be like, what? I didn't say that. So this study started from the premise that both verbal and visual cues can convey political views in a manner that is not obtrusive. However, knowledge about cue effects is limited to those prompted by verbal cues. So what we wanted to do is to assess the effects of visual cues that are related to political ideology. We call them subtle backdrop cues. They are a key component of political images, as you have noticed in the example before. They communicate ideology and through that electability, and they are used strategically and frequently. Now, if you ask political strategists, they will tell you that SBCs work, and that's why they are being used. Well, this is something that should be tested. And this is what we've done here. More specifically, we have included subtle visual cues to political ideology in the backdrop of images, so behind images of politicians. And those images we then embedded in Twitter posts. Then we have assessed the influence of exposure to SBCs on a couple of things. First, the ideology of the depicted politician as the participants perceived it, their intention to vote for the politician, and conditional effects elicited by cue awareness, so whether I have acknowledged that there was a cue in the background, in the ideological consistency between the depicted politician and the participant. So if one is conservative, the other is conservative too, that would be ideological consistency. More specifically, if we now look at the literature, we will find about cues in political communication. We will find two specific suggestions with regard to how citizens can cope with information asymmetry. Remember, information asymmetry means that one side knows more than the other. In this case, that politicians are being vague and that they know more than the citizens do and that they do not communicate that clearly. So there are two options with regard to coping with this information asymmetry. On the one hand, people could devote time and effort to learning more. Well, ideally, they would do that if this has a great democratic appeal. However, this is also unrealistic. So what we notice more often is that people take cues and infer the rest, thus that they are making decisions with low effort. So this is why we are dealing with cues here. Now, what kind of cues? There are two main categories. There are party cues, so labels like the Republicans, and logos, those used by politicians, by political parties. Well, most research is actually on these party cues. We know that they are very salient, which means that normally it's very easy to infer policy positions from them. However, they do not always help. For instance, in the case of a new party, a new issue, or in the case of local politics. So there is a second category of cues, and those are ideology cues. What they can do is to point to ideology, be it right-wing conservative or left-wing liberal, and they are considered to be very important or growing in importance, but they are yet under-researched. To give you an example, a framed photo on a politician's desk, religious symbols hanging on somebody's wall, or photo props like weapons or flags. Yes, so that's why we are dealing with ideology cues here because of the research gap. So what do we know about ideology cues? We know that they can be verbal or visual, and for the reason I have just explained, we are going to focus on the visual cues. They are not as explicit as the verbal cues, but they are there, and anecdotal evidence suggests that they are being used. So when I speak of subtle backdrop cues or short SBCs, what I mean is cues that are visual, that suggest ideology, that are embedded in images, and they are subtle. They are subtle in the sense that they are in the background, not in the foreground of an image, but in the background. Okay, so we have theorized on the effects of exposure to SBCs. Sorry, there are some examples here that I forgot about. So to illustrate, this is an image without a subtle backdrop cue, and the next two contain a subtle backdrop cue. if you look in the background, you will see, just as I mentioned before, an image, a framed photo of what may be the wife of the politician on his desk. And the picture in the middle shows her in a professional role, whereas the very last photo shows her pulling a roast out of the oven, so in a classical role. Okay, so based on this, we have theorized on the effects of exposure to subtle backdrop cues and used effect studies on verbal cues as a starting point. In particular, we knew that people can infer a politician's ideology based on verbal cues, even when party cues are suppressed. In that case, cues are very helpful because citizens can understand from them politicians' positions on the issues that are cued verbally, and also are able to infer positions on issues barely touched upon or left unaddressed. So, long story short, verbal cues allow citizens to reach high quality, low effort decisions that resemble those formed when citizens truly become informed, weigh arguments, and evaluate the credibility of sources. And they're particularly helpful for unknown candidates. Here, the cues sent by the candidates were shown to expose their political ideologies, which then identified them as a friend or a foe, and thus more or less viable for office from the perspective of the individual citizen. Previous research has also suggested that such tendencies are often more pronounced in individuals with strong group identities. So, will it work for visuals? On the one hand, you have the ambiguity of visuals. So the fact that they are not explicit and that they can be interpreted in various ways. On the other hand, we know that visuals are processed without much effort, so automatically, and that and that it's up to viewers to co-construct the meaning of visuals, meaning that they have to infer what something means based on cues. Since their participation is needed, effects might actually be stronger once the cues are being encoded. So, this brings me to the first hypothesis, which is that exposure to SBCs would influence perceived political ideology. So, the ideology of politician as perceived by citizens. This was our first dependent variable. However, we have assumed that cue awareness would act as a moderator in the sense that when people are being activated, so is their information processing and their memory. In this case, cue awareness should lead to stronger effects. So the second hypothesis pretty much expected just that high cue awareness would elicit stronger effects. Moreover, so you see this here, the moderation. Moreover, we have expected to encounter spillover effects on voting intention. So that the perceived political ideology, we know this from verbal cues literature, would predict voting intention. However, that this effect, we were also expected that this effect would be moderated. So you see it here, voting intention and the moderated effect from SBC treatment to perceived ideology down to voting intention, and you see the two moderations on the side. So the hypothesis here was put simply, if somebody thinks that a politician is conservative based on the cues identified in the background, then that person will decide whether to vote or not for the politician in question based on the extent to which the individual shares the ideology of the politician. If I self-identify as conservative, then my intention to vote for a politician whom I perceive to be conservative will likely increase. On the other hand, if I identify as conservative, but I identify the politician as, I perceive the politician as liberal, then voting intention should decrease. Okay, so let's look a bit at the design and the participants. We have conducted an online study with nearly 400 participants and had a sample that was rather balanced in terms of age and gender, but somewhat better educated than the average. We have pre-tested the images that we used extensively with a couple of goals in mind. First, we wanted to account for the ambiguous nature of visuals and prevent ceiling effects. Thus, we wanted to make sure that images are perceived as we expect them to be, and also wanted to ensure that the characteristics of the fictitious politician and of the photos used elicit rather neutral ratings on perceived ideology, which was the key dependent variable. So we had about 30 people in each pretest, and here with the second pretest, the goal was to ensure that the stimuli are perceived as realistic rather than constructed and or Photoshop. And we found that our insertion of SBCs had no significant effect on this. So the experimental manipulation, I'm going to walk you through this really quickly. We had 13 tweets attributed to a fictitious local politician whom we've called Peter Behrens. We had a couple of text-only tweets, a couple of text and image tweets, and we have manipulated four tweets, including SPCs. In one condition, they cued conservative ideology. In the other, they have cued liberal ideology. And in the control group, they were removed from the images containing them. So everything was held constant except for those 4 tweets. So we had 9 tweets without SPCs and 4 tweets appealing to one or the other ideology. Okay, and here are just a couple of examples. We actually used the one I just showed you with a woman with a picture on his desk. We also used this one with the flags. You see here the German flag in the background. On the left side, in the middle, you see the European flag, and the control group on the right, no flag at all. Okay, so if you want to walk through this at your own pace, here are the stimuli that we have used on the 4 issues that you can see on the left-hand side. So women's rights, religion, nationalism, and drug policy. And these are the tweets without SPCs that were held constant across conditions. If you want to know more about our measures, they are inserted here. I will move on to the data analysis. We have used process in order to test this. What else? And here come our findings. So we have found that SBCs have indeed influenced perceived ideology. However, only when SBC awareness was moderate or high. In addition, we have found that perceived ideology had affected voting intention, but that respondents' personal political ideology has moderated this effect. Okay, so what? Why have we done this, and what's the main takeaway? We believe to be the first ones to have provided evidence that subtle backdrop cues actually matter. They influence citizens' perceptions of political ideology, and from there on, voting intention. Remember, however, that these effects are moderated by cue awareness and ideological consistency. So what we've done was to confirm and expand knowledge from research on verbal cues. Of course, as with any study, this one also has a couple of limitations. Most importantly, we have only focused on short-term effects, have used a fictitious and a male politician, and had liberals a bit quite clearly actually overrepresented in our sample. So you may wonder about the generalizability of these results, and indeed we would need a more balanced sample in the future. And we would seek to replicate this in future studies. Another idea for effect studies would be to analyze the effects of visual cues versus verbal ones. Let me talk to you a bit about implications. So I want to distinguish here between practical implications and normative implications. With the practical implications is it such that we have found empirical evidence supporting the widely held belief that visual cues have substantial effects. So the practical implication of this would be that SPCs can be used to determine which one of many positions on new issues resonates most with constituents. Also, to take a provocative stance on hot-button issues while maintaining the option to backpedal, you remember, and redemption in the case of a public outcry. Now, of course, normatively speaking, this is a mixed blessing. On the one hand, SBCs push the boundaries of responsible and socially acceptable discourse. So they manipulate citizens when their guard is down. But on the other hand, citizens at least have the chance to know more than politicians divulge explicitly. So a mixed blessing. So the conclusion of this is that citizens wanting to form an opinion about politicians often rely on subtle cues, and that empirical knowledge about cue effects has up until now been limited to those prompted by verbal cues. We have, however, found out that SBCs allow citizens to infer the ideology of the politician, and that this results in an influence on voting intentions. And this is it. Do let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for your attention.